Molly Burke had never considered herself overly private, but after decades in the corporate world and the steady unraveling of a marriage built more on appearances than substance, she discovered a craving for silence she hadn't known existed. When she bought the old brick house on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, it was with the kind of purposefulness that came not from impulse but from exhaustion. She wanted a place where she could hear herself think, where the world would leave her alone, and where her life, finally, wholly, could be her own. The house wasn't grand, but it had bones, real ones. Tall windows, creaking floors with stories in their grain, and a yard big enough to breathe in. What it lacked in polish, it made up for in dignity. Molly had the entire property enclosed with a professionally built brick wall. Nothing extravagant, just solid, clean lines, a clear statement of where her space began and ended. She landscaped the garden herself, lined the interior of the wall with shade-loving plants, added motion lights, and had a large steel gate installed at the driveway. Security cameras went up too, but not the intrusive kind, just enough to deter, to let others know. This space is watched. This space is mine. The neighborhood was polite in the way long-settled communities often are, cordial but not inviting, observant without being warm. Molly didn't mind. She wasn't here to make friends, not at her age, not after the last few years of emotional warfare disguised as marital compromise. She kept to herself, went on early morning walks with her dog Reggie, and waved to neighbors only if they waved first. A quiet life. A clean one. Karen Ellis lived 2 houses down. Molly noticed her the first week after moving in, though Karen never approached directly. She was always visible in the periphery, trimming hedges, speaking too loudly on her phone just beyond the fence, or slowly walking her small white poodle past Molly's driveway and pausing just long enough to glance inside. There was something theatrical about her. Her movements too composed, her expressions calculated to appear spontaneous. Karen's house was spotless, her garden manicured with military precision, and her mailbox bore a plaque. Ellis family, Est, 1978. As if the year alone granted her jurisdiction over the entire block. Still, there was no immediate friction. Karen waved occasionally, and Molly returned the gesture with the same neutral politeness she afforded to everyone else. But there was something. An undertone in Karen's body language and the way she lingered just a second too long at the gate that told Molly this woman didn't see herself as just another neighbor. Karen watched. She assessed. And Molly, having been married to a man who spoke in legal clauses and lived by strategies, recognized when someone was cataloging her. For the first couple of months, everything seemed normal enough. Molly unpacked, adjusted, repainted rooms, planted new trees, replaced outdated fixtures. Her routine became predictable in the best way. Tea at sunrise, emails and paperwork mid-morning, gardening in the early afternoon, Reggie's long walk before dinner, and evenings on the porch with a book and wine. It wasn't thrilling, but it was peaceful. It felt earned. Then, 3 months after moving in, something strange happened. It was a Tuesday. Cloudy, windless, quiet. Molly returned from grocery shopping, turned into her driveway, and something felt off. She couldn't place it at first. There was no noise, no movement. But as she unloaded the bags from her trunk and glanced toward the rear of her property, she saw it. A metallic glint. A vertical seam in the brick where there had never been one before. She left the bags and walked toward it, slowly, almost unwilling to believe her own eyes. There, embedded into the rear portion of her fence, facing a back alley that no one used, was a narrow iron gate. Not new, not rustic. Just there, installed cleanly into the brickwork as if it had always been part of the structure. Except it hadn't. She had designed that wall herself, oversaw the permits, the construction, the ceiling. This gate was not part of her design. The most bizarre part wasn't the gate itself, but what lay behind it. Nothing. Directly behind the gate, through the bars, if you peered carefully, was the same brick wall forming the interior boundary of her property. The gate, quite literally, opened into a wall. No walkway, no alley access, no adjoining property feature, just a gate, locked from the other side, leading to a solid surface. It made no sense. Molly didn't panic. She was past the age of hysteria, and her nature had always skewed toward logic. Still, she found herself standing there far longer than necessary, her breath shallow, her pulse oddly elevated. She took out her phone and photographed the structure from several angles. The lighting was soft, flat, and the images looked surreal in their normality. It was as though the gate had always been there. Seamless brickwork, matching iron style, hinges drilled into place. But it hadn't been. She knew it hadn't. Reggie growled as she approached the gate. The dog rarely made noise. Molly crouched beside him, one hand resting on his back, feeling the low, steady vibration of unease. She reached out and gripped the gate's iron bar. It was cold, unused. She tugged. It didn't move. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a low-grade state of preoccupation. Her thoughts looped back again and again to the impossibility of it. She reviewed her camera footage from the past week. Nothing. No workers, no trucks, no activity near that section of the property. She even checked the footage from the street cameras she could access. Nothing useful. It was as if the gate had simply appeared. That night, she couldn't sleep. At 1:30, she slipped out onto the porch with a throw blanket and sat listening to the wind stir through the hedges. Reggie lay at her feet, ears alert. Around 2, she heard it. A faint metallic click. She rose, slowly, barefoot, and walked to the rear window. The gate was in view, motionless, silent. But the feeling had changed. The yard felt different, less like hers. By morning, the gate was the same. Still, locked. But a new detail had emerged. A single clay planter, placed precisely in front of the gate, containing a cluster of pale blue flowers. Hydrangeas, neatly arranged, watered. And that was the moment Molly realized something else. Someone had been on her property. Not a vandal, not a thief. Someone with a purpose. Someone who saw the gate as something other than what it was. Or, perhaps, who saw the wall as something other than what it was. The clay pot had no fingerprint smudges, no note, no marking. But it was fresh. The soil was damp. The petals unblemished. Whoever had left it had done so with care. She picked it up, walked it back to her front porch, and placed it beside the recycling bin. Then she stood there for a long while, not looking at the flowers but at the horizon beyond her fence, where the rooftops lay still in the morning haze, and wondered not how this had happened, but why, and whether Karen had seen, whether Karen had known, or worse, whether Karen had done it. Molly didn't let the presence of the gate consume her right away, though it hovered in her awareness like the dull ache of a tooth not yet infected. She went about her next day with deliberate normalcy, tending to her garden beds, preparing meals, even responding to emails she had ignored for too long. But the thought was there, always just behind her eyes. Someone had entered her property without permission, installed a structure that did not belong, and left a gesture, a potted plant, as if this intrusion were a gift. That evening, she drove to the city's zoning office and requested a property line verification along with any recent modification permits filed in her area. The woman behind the counter clicked through her computer with casual disinterest before confirming that no permits had been filed for Molly's address in over 4 months, and certainly none concerning gate installations. Molly wasn't surprised. He had waited, documented, prepared, and now, at last, acted. Because if someone was going to test the law in his house, they'd better be ready to answer for it. And she wasn't. The officers arrived in under 9 minutes. No envelope, just a folded page with a brief typed message. Please do not remove the access gate. It has historical relevance and must remain. No further action is necessary. Thank you for your cooperation. No signature, no name. The wording was dry, almost bureaucratic in tone, but the fact that it was delivered directly into her home, through a door she kept locked, sent a chill through her spine. She checked all entry points. Everything was locked. Reggie hadn't barked, hadn't stirred. Whoever delivered that note knew exactly how to move undetected. She contacted the police, explained the situation calmly but firmly, and asked to file a report regarding unauthorized access and installation of private property fixtures. The officer who came out was polite, younger than she expected, and seemed sympathetic. But after walking the perimeter, inspecting the gate, and asking a few questions, he offered the same canned explanation Molly had already braced for. Without witnesses, without clear evidence of forced entry or damage, there was little they could do. It was, as he put it, a civil matter. Molly felt the edges of her composure tighten. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't argue. But as the officer left and she stood once again in front of the gate, she placed both hands on the iron and stared through the bars. On the other side, the wall loomed, impenetrable, blank. The gate still didn't open. There was no visible lock on her side, only a smooth latch with no keyhole. She traced its frame with her fingers, feeling the precision of the installation. This had been done by a professional, not by someone improvising or experimenting. Someone had planned this, knew the layout of her wall, had the tools and knowledge to cut cleanly through brick, anchor the hinges, and seal the perimeter without leaving debris, and all of it without alerting her dog, or her security system. By that afternoon, Molly had her lawyer draft a cease and desist notice, naming any and all responsible parties associated with the unauthorized modification of private property located at her address. The letter was posted to her front door and emailed to the neighborhood association, along with a direct message sent to her immediate neighbors, including Karen Ellis. The message was polite but firm, stating that legal action would follow if the gate was not removed or claimed within 5 business days. The next 48 hours were silent. No responses, no acknowledgement. No new flower pots or notes. Then, on the 3rd day, Karen appeared. She didn't knock. Molly was on the front porch, trimming back her hydrangeas, when the woman strolled casually up the walkway with a confident stride and a bright smile, as though they were old friends reconnecting over tea. Karen wore pale slacks, a silk blouse, and carried a tray with 2 mismatched teacups. Without waiting for permission, she placed the tray on the small table beside Molly's bench and sat down. "I thought we should talk," she said, as if she were doing Molly a favor by making time in her schedule. Molly remained standing, the garden shears still in her hand, and didn't return the smile. "Did you put in that gate?" she asked, not bothering with preamble. Karen tilted her head, the way some people do when they're trying to decide whether to lie. "It's not really a gate," she replied. "It's more of a restoration. That section of the wall used to have a passage. Years ago, long before either of us were here, I simply reinstated it." Molly stared at her. "Without permission." Karen sipped from her cup and set it down. Sometimes history doesn't wait for permission. Sometimes it needs to breathe again. There was something unnervingly calm about her voice. No guilt, no defensiveness. Just a quiet certainty that made Molly's skin crawl. She didn't raise her voice. She simply repeated, You trespassed. You altered my property. That's a crime." Karen smiled again, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "If it bothers you, I'm sorry, but I don't think it should. You've built such a beautiful place here. It deserves to be connected. To the past. To what was always meant to be." Molly didn't respond. She walked inside, closed the door behind her, and watched through the front window as Karen gathered her tray and walked back down the street, humming to herself. That night, Reggie barked. Not wildly, not an alarm, just once. A sharp, guttural sound that woke Molly from a light sleep. She checked the monitors. Nothing moved. But in the morning, there was a new detail at the gate. A single sprig of lavender, tied neatly to the center bar with red string. She called her lawyer again. This time she wanted a formal injunction. Her lawyer advised patience. "We need a named party," he explained. "We can't target Karen without proof of her involvement, and we can't file a property damage suit without confirmed entry or recorded tampering. The gate, as you've said, is not actively in use. There's no ongoing intrusion. You've documented everything. Let's proceed methodically." But Molly had never been the kind to wait passively. She hired a private contractor, someone she trusted, to examine the structure. He came early, worked quietly, and confirmed what she suspected. The gate was integrated directly into the structural joints of the wall. Whoever installed it had access to blueprints, or at least detailed measurements. Removing it would require more than a patch job. It would mean cutting deep, rebricking the section, and potentially compromising the integrity of the entire section, if not done carefully. "It's not a backyard job," he said, wiping dust from his gloves. "This was surgical. Whoever did this, they weren't improvising." That night, Molly sat on her porch and tried to replay every step she had taken since moving in. Every conversation. Every passerby. Every delivery. She thought of Karen's expression, the strange warmth in her voice when she spoke of connection. The way she hadn't asked for anything, hadn't threatened, just acted, and she began to wonder if this was ever really about a gate, or if the gate was only the beginning. In the days following the contractor's visit, Molly began to feel the shape of her life change, not with a dramatic rupture, but with a slow, imperceptible pressure that rearranged her days, her thoughts, and even the way she moved through her home. Her routine lost its rhythm. She would catch herself glancing out the window every few minutes, scanning the back garden where the gate sat inert and wordless like a misplaced monument. Reggie grew more alert, too. Not aggressive, but watchful. He had begun sleeping near the back door, and Molly no longer stopped him. Whatever instincts lived beneath his ribs had surfaced, and she had long since learned to trust them. 3 nights later, the gate opened. It happened just past midnight. The motion-triggered porch camera captured the exact moment. The latch clicked, the iron creaked slightly on its hinges, and the gate moved inward, toward Molly's property, only a few inches. Then it stopped. No one appeared. No one entered or exited. The footage showed no figures, no movement beyond the gate, no vehicles. Just the gate opening slightly as if nudged by a whisper of wind, and remaining there, ajar. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, Molly stood before it and saw the shift with her own eyes. The gate no longer sat flush with the wall. The latch was unhooked. She reached out carefully and pressed her palm against the cold iron. It resisted at first, then swung open without resistance. On the other side, still, was brick. No new door, no path carved through, just the same immovable wall she had always known. She closed it again, this time sliding the latch shut. It clicked into place with a softness that somehow made her uneasy. Within an hour, she had submitted new footage to the police and her attorney, as well as a formal escalation request with the city's Property Violation Board. Her lawyer agreed this changed things. "Now we have evidence of manipulation," he said. "It's not an active threat, but it demonstrates physical interference with your structure. That's leverage." She expected that to be the end of it. She hoped, stupidly perhaps, that the act had been symbolic, a message, and that whoever had opened it would now retreat, satisfied with whatever statement they believed they'd made. But Molly underestimated how far someone like Karen could push without ever raising her voice or leaving a footprint. That was the nature of this conflict. It didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in like dampness behind the walls, invisible at first, and then suddenly everywhere. 2 days later, the wall was vandalized. Not graffitied, not spray-painted by teenagers or tagged with slurs. What Molly found at dawn was something else entirely. Etched deeply and precisely into the lower bricks beside the gate was a word: return. The letters were tall, sharp, perfectly spaced, as if stenciled with a ruler and a chisel. There were no signs of dust or debris, no footprints in the damp earth nearby. Just that one word, carved with methodical care, visible from halfway across the yard. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took out her phone, photographed the carving, and sent it to her lawyer. Then she called the police again, who arrived with a different tone this time. The same young officer returned, but his demeanor had changed. He wasn't dismissive, but he looked wary, more so of the situation than of Molly herself. He examined the etching, took new statements, logged the report. "We'll add this to the record," he said, "but unless there's damage beyond the brick or threat to your safety, there's still no grounds for criminal charges." Molly didn't argue. She was tired of arguing with people whose job was to follow rules that hadn't been written for this kind of conflict. The law worked well when things were obvious: break-ins, violence, theft, but not when they were slow, insidious invasions that relied on ambiguity. The officer left. Molly stood in her garden with Reggie at her side and stared at the gate again. For the first time since moving in, she felt like she no longer fully owned her home. The next escalation came not from Karen directly, but from a third party. That Friday, Molly received a thick envelope via certified mail. It was from a group calling itself the Regional Cultural Access Trust, an organization she'd never heard of. Inside was a letter on cream-colored paper with an embossed emblem, 2 interlocking keys, and a formal tone that made her stomach twist. The letter read, "Dear Ms. Burke, we understand that recent restoration efforts to legacy access points within your property may have caused confusion. Please be advised that said access holds registered relevance within our historical corridor records. While not enforceable under municipal law, this corridor has been acknowledged by the Trust and its predecessor committees for over 40 years. We ask that you refrain from obstructing or altering the gate structure at this time. Representatives will follow up with additional documentation in due course." There was no contact information, no phone number, just a post office box from another city and a stylized signature, R. Hamner, Regional Secretary. Molly read it 3 times. Then she ran an online search for the organization. Nothing, no website, no articles, no record in the nonprofit registry. It was a ghost. A letterhead. A name crafted for legitimacy and intimidation. She scanned the emblem and sent it to her attorney, who replied in minutes. Fraudulent. No such entity in state records. We'll add this to our file. Do not engage. The next morning, a delivery truck arrived at her address with a crate addressed not to Molly, but to Caretaker, Gate 47. The delivery man looked confused. "Says to drop at rear access," he muttered, pointing to a printed label. Molly refused the delivery, took a photo of the label, and called her lawyer again. He listened quietly, then asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Do you want to start surveillance beyond the cameras you've got?" Molly hesitated. She wasn't someone who liked to feel hunted, but something had shifted. She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Yes," she said. "I think it's time." That night, 2 men in unmarked uniforms came to her property, carefully installing discrete motion sensors in the soil near the back wall, repositioning cameras to create overlapping fields of vision, and mapping blind spots she hadn't considered. They worked silently, efficiently, and left without comment. Molly stood in the dark after they were gone, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the gate. It was still closed, still latched, but it felt alive now, as if the iron had learned to breathe. She tried to sleep, but around 3 a.m, Reggie began growling from the hallway. Not barking, growling. A low, steady sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Molly sat up in bed, heart hammering, and listened. There were no footsteps, no noise from outside, but she could feel it. Something had changed again. She walked barefoot through the house, turned on no lights, and stood in the kitchen facing the yard. Outside, nothing moved. But when she opened the door and stepped into the cold, she saw it instantly. The gate was open. Wide open this time. The latch was still in place but had been disengaged cleanly, silently. And on the brick wall opposite the gate, someone had placed a piece of paper, taped carefully with blue painter's tape to the center of the stone. Molly stepped forward, peeled it off, and unfolded it. Inside, in neat handwriting, were 5 words. One way or another, always. She burned the note. Then she reset the latch, checked every lock in her home, and sat by the window until sunrise, her fingers curled tight around the mug of cooling tea. She understood now. This wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about rights or history, or even Karen. This was about territory, about presence, about pressure. Someone was trying to make her leave, not with violence, but with weight. Quiet, persistent, eroding weight. And Molly had no intention of giving them what they wanted. Molly didn't expect a resolution, not anymore. She understood that this was no longer about a single violation or one intrusive neighbor. It had become something systemic, invisible, and persistent. The gate, the letters, the crate, the note, each one had chipped away not just at her legal boundaries, but at the emotional perimeter she had worked so hard to build around her life. And yet, despite the escalation, she remained. She adjusted. She reinforced. She adapted not out of fear, but because she understood something that she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. Whoever was behind this didn't want to confront her directly. They wanted her displaced, disoriented, pushed into overreacting or retreating. But Molly was neither impulsive nor fragile. That had never been her nature. A week passed without new incidents, and while the silence was a relief, it was also suspicious. Her cameras recorded nothing. The gate remained shut, and Reggie's behavior normalized. Restless still, but less reactive. During that time, Molly's lawyer submitted formal documentation to local authorities, citing unlawful property modifications and evidence of stalking-level harassment. The police had opened a formal case file now, not just a stack of disconnected reports, but a singular, coded entry. That small bureaucratic step gave her a strange kind of comfort. Not because she expected the system to suddenly deliver justice, but because the situation had crossed a threshold. It was no longer private. It was recorded. Still, questions remained. Who was coordinating this? Karen's presence had waned in recent days. Molly hadn't seen her outside since the last time she brought tea uninvited. The curtains of Karen's house stayed drawn, the porch remained undisturbed, and there were no signs of visitors. But Molly didn't buy the act. Karen was too deliberate to be silent without reason. So when a letter arrived, not through the door this time, but via registered mail with a real name and return address, it broke the rhythm of silence with surgical precision. The envelope was addressed from a law firm, Lemming, Pike and Durrell, LLP. The letter inside was short and chillingly formal. It stated that Ms. Karen Ellis, through her representation, was submitting a claim of historic right-of-way use pertaining to Molly's rear boundary, citing a disputed corridor referenced in neighborhood plat documents dated back to 1974. The letter requested a voluntary allowance for transitional community access, emphasizing the significance of legacy movement between lots as part of a historic layout, now obscured by modern development. There was no demand, no threat, just a quiet, bureaucratic invasion cloaked in terminology that sounded reasonable only to those unfamiliar with how pressure was applied in property disputes. But Molly had read enough contracts in her career to know this wasn't a request. It was a foundation stone, placed methodically for a much larger structure that hadn't been built yet. She forwarded the letter to her attorney. He called her within the hour, voice clipped, focused. It's not legally enforceable, but they're laying the groundwork. They're hoping you'll settle, grant some form of concession, even temporary. That gives them a foothold. Don't respond, don't engage, and don't under any circumstances allow physical access to that area. Ever. Molly felt her jaw tighten as he spoke, but she thanked him calmly and hung up. That night, instead of sitting by the window with her usual quiet vigilance, she walked the full perimeter of the wall. Not just near the gate, but every line of brick from end to end. She checked for new markings, new objects, anything out of place. It was a strange thing to feel like you had to patrol your own sanctuary, but that was what it had become, a territory under slow siege. 2 days later, the electrician arrived. She hadn't called him. There was no appointment on her calendar, but at 8 a.m. sharp, a white van with a local company logo pulled into her driveway, and a man stepped out with a clipboard. "Morning, ma'am," he said cheerfully. "Here to check the outdoor connections. Work order says gate sensor upgrade." Molly didn't raise her voice, but her tone sharpened. "There is no gate sensor, and I didn't order anything." The man blinked, confused, then double-checked his clipboard. "Name says Burke, rear wall install, paid in advance. All materials delivered last night." She stepped closer. "Where were they delivered?" He pointed toward the side gate. "Didn't you see them? Left against the brick. Conduit, sensor hubs, a remote latch unit. Standard gear for smart access." She walked briskly around the house, and there it was. A bundle of equipment wrapped in clear plastic, precisely stacked beside the back section of the fence. She hadn't seen or heard a delivery, but the items were real, tagged, logged. She returned to the electrician. "Take it and go. You've been scammed. Someone's using your service to mess with my property." He apologized, flustered, and began to pack the gear back into his van. Molly watched him drive off and then stood alone on the side path, staring at the imprint the packages had left on the grass. They weren't just trying to pressure her anymore. They were beginning to simulate legitimacy. Fake deliveries, paper trails, manufactured confusion. They wanted to bury her in the appearance of a dispute until the truth became just one opinion among many. That evening, her lawyer introduced her to a private surveyor with legal credentials. Together, they began building a detailed historical map of the property and surrounding lots, combing through archived records, plat maps, and aerial photographs. It was slow work, but necessary. And in the process, something surfaced, something neither Molly nor her lawyer expected. A document dated 1982, filed under the name of the developer who built the original homes in the area, referenced a now-defunct community linkage plan that had proposed walking paths connecting lots in a way that never received final approval. According to the note, the plan had been informally trialed, using temporary gates between specific properties, including the one Karen now occupied and the one Molly had purchased decades later. The key detail: the path had been marked on some early drafts of the layout but was officially abandoned before construction began. That discovery changed everything. It confirmed that there had once been intention, but never execution. It also confirmed that Karen, or someone on her behalf, had access to those preliminary drafts, likely distorted them to appear like official documents, and used them as a basis for her claim. The evidence wasn't damning on its own, but in legal terms, it was enough to challenge the narrative. Enough to call the bluff. Enough to reveal motive. Molly sat in silence after reviewing the report. It was all starting to align. The gate, the letters, the strange deliveries, the symbolic language about return and connection. Karen wasn't just meddling. She was trying to revive something that had never been born. An idea that was buried in paperwork and forgotten drafts. And she had made it her mission to restore it, not for practicality, not for community, but for control. Because control was the only thing that mattered to people like Karen. Molly stood, closed the file, and walked outside. The gate stood in shadow. The latch was still shut. But everything about it felt different now. Not because the threat had passed, but because the mask had finally slipped. Now, Molly knew what she was up against, and she had no intention of letting anyone rewrite the ground beneath her feet. The knowledge that the community linkage plan had never been implemented brought Molly a brief sense of vindication, but it didn't last. There was no announcement of retreat, no apology tucked under her door, and certainly no sign that Karen or whoever operated beside her had backed off. Instead, everything went quiet again. Too quiet. It was a silence that felt less like a pause and more like a calibration. Molly knew enough from years of boardroom warfare to understand that when someone loses the first round, they often stop talking, not because they've surrendered, but because they're repositioning. And reposition they did. It began with a complaint, not a direct message, not a confrontation, but an official letter submitted to the Municipal Code Compliance Office claiming that Molly's renovated boundary wall violated historic height restrictions and obstructed visual continuity of communal easement aesthetics. The phrasing was pure bureaucratic gibberish, carefully designed to sound credible to anyone unfamiliar with the property. Molly's lawyer intercepted the notice within days of it being issued, and responded swiftly with permits, blueprints, and photographic documentation proving the wall was entirely legal and unchanged from its permitted state. But the damage wasn't in the complaint itself. It was in the sudden visibility. The inspection meant strangers on her property, notes taken by clipboard-wielding compliance agents, and the impression, if only briefly, that Molly had done something wrong. A few days later, she noticed something even more troubling. Her address had been marked online, specifically on a property discussion forum she hadn't known existed. An anonymous post labeled Burke Gatewall Dispute listed her name, her general location, and a summary so twisted it barely resembled the truth. It read, "Longtime resident Karen Ellis seeks restoration of a legacy pedestrian right-of-way denied by new homeowner. Gate blocked, neighbor claims false vandalism, police involved. Community divided." Below the post were comments from anonymous users debating whether property rights should override public historical significance. None of the names were real, but the style felt familiar. Controlled, as if steered by one or two, consistent hands under many aliases. Molly took screenshots of the form and forwarded them to her lawyer, who added it to their growing case file. But the anxiety didn't come from the content itself. It came from the escalation of tactics. She wasn't just being pressured through physical space anymore. Her reputation, her version of the story, was being manipulated in the shadows. It was information warfare, and it made her skin crawl. Then came the drone. It was a small, white quadcopter, the kind sold to hobbyists and amateur surveyors, and it appeared one afternoon without sound or warning. Molly had been watering the garden when she heard a strange mechanical whir overhead. She looked up and saw it hovering, unmoving, just above the eastern edge of her property. It didn't cross directly over the wall, but it lingered within clear visual range of the house. She raised a hand, and it tilted slightly in response, tracking her movement. Reggie barked from inside the house, pressing his snout to the window. Molly didn't move. She stared at the thing for a full 30 seconds before it finally retreated, banking silently toward the street and vanishing between the trees. She called the police again, reported the incident, and was told, predictably, that unless the drone had entered her airspace or recorded activity in private areas like windows or fenced-in patios, it wasn't a criminal matter. She had to file a civil motion if she wanted to push for identification. Her lawyer began that process immediately, but Molly didn't feel any satisfaction. She felt observed, catalogued, assessed. The message was clear. Even in her silence, she wasn't invisible. She responded by installing a temporary mesh net over the rear portion of her yard. Unsightly, yes, but effective. It disrupted aerial line of sight and reminded her, at least psychologically, that not every vantage point was available to her adversary. But the tension was building again. She could feel it in the rhythm of her days, the shift in how neighbors glanced at her when she passed. Politeness now came with a question mark. She wasn't sure how many people had read the post or heard Karen's version of events. All she knew was that isolation had crept back in. Then the breaking point arrived. It was a Saturday morning, bright, crisp air, the kind that made everything feel harmless. Molly went to check the rear fence as she always did, and froze. The gate was open, not ajar, not nudged, but fully open, swung inward. And the brick wall that had always stood behind it? A hole. Not large, not dramatic. Just 1 square meter of missing brick, carved cleanly away to reveal the dark interior of the wall's structure. Mortar dust lay on the grass below, fresh, untouched. No footprints, no tools. Just absence. She stepped closer, hand unconsciously reaching for her phone. The camera lens framed the gaping square like a wound. It wasn't an accident. This had been done with precision. She looked into the gap and saw no passage, just hollow space, framing beams, and concrete backing. It wasn't a tunnel, just an invitation. Or maybe a message. Either way, it had crossed the final line. She called the police again. This time, they took it seriously. The damage was undeniable. Officers photographed the hole, took statements, and reviewed her camera footage. But the footage was corrupted. Just a blur of static where the moment should have been. Her system had been tampered with. Not externally. Internally. Someone had masked the feed. The officers filed a report and promised to follow up with a detective. Molly didn't wait. She hired a private security firm that same afternoon and authorized them to set up remote monitoring and motion-triggered response. Armed patrol, overnight sensors, external lighting, everything short of installing an armed guard. Later that day, her lawyer arrived in person, files in hand. They sat on the back patio while Reggie paced nervously by the door. The lawyer looked tired, but his voice was steady. "They're trying to provoke you. Not to act violently, but to break, psychologically. You're holding the line, but we need to hit back now. Legally, publicly, visibly. I've drafted an injunction, and I've contacted a property rights advocate to begin a formal countersuit. But I also need you to document your story, in writing, in your own words, because at some point they're going to spin this harder, and I need your narrative unshakable." Molly didn't flinch. She nodded and said she'd begin that night. But when she went inside and sat at her desk, staring at the blinking cursor, the words wouldn't come. Not because she didn't know what had happened, but because she was afraid, truly afraid, that telling the story would make it permanent, that writing it down would legitimize the invasion in ways she couldn't undo. So she didn't write. Not yet. Instead, she locked every door, tested every light, sat with Reggie at her feet, and waited for the sky to darken. The gate remained open all night. She didn't go near it. She didn't close it. Something about it, standing there like a mouth in the wall, made her feel like she'd lose something by touching it. It stayed open for 3 full days. Then, without warning, it was closed again. No noise, no visitors, just shut. And on the morning of the 4th day, a package arrived. Not by mail, not by courier, but sitting on her porch chair. A small wooden box with a brass latch. Inside, a photograph. Black and white. Faded. It showed her backyard, or what it would have looked like 30 years ago. Same trees, same fence line, but no house. Just open space. And in the center of the image, 2 children stood. One with their back to the camera. The other, smiling, looking straight ahead, had Karen's face. Molly didn't cry. She didn't scream. She closed the box, placed it inside a fireproof safe, and then she sat at her desk and began to write. Not out of fear anymore, but because she understood. This wasn't about right or wrong, or even winning. It was about outlasting. And she knew how to do that better than anyone. By the time the court date was scheduled, Molly felt less like a homeowner and more like the lone defender of contested terrain, as though her property were a strategic checkpoint on some forgotten map of ideological warfare. The hole in her wall had since been patched. Her contractor had managed to source the exact brick type, matching both shade and age, but the scar still lingered in her mind far more vividly than in the mortar. The gate, too, had been reinforced. A steel crossbar installed on her side kept it locked in place, immovable even under brute force. Yet nothing physical could undo the psychological shift that had taken root. The calm she'd once found in her garden had vanished, replaced by constant scanning, the endless mental checklist of what was in its place, what had changed, what might come next. The silence from Karen's end grew heavier, almost ceremonial. There had been no new messages, no unmarked packages or midnight visitors. Her house stood still, the curtains always drawn, the lawn inexplicably pristine. But that silence wasn't peace. It was preparation, the sound of something collecting itself behind thick walls. Molly didn't know what to expect from the hearing. It wasn't a full trial, just an emergency injunction and preliminary hearing for the countersuit her lawyer had filed, along with a cease and desist request backed by their documentation of trespass, harassment, and unlawful structural interference. She dressed plainly that morning, in dark slacks and a neutral blouse, no jewelry, her hair tied back. She didn't want to appear combative or defensive. She wanted to look like what she was, someone who had asked to be left alone and been denied that right again and again. Her lawyer met her outside the municipal building, a slim leather folder in hand, calm but alert. Inside, in the high-ceilinged administrative courtroom that still smelled faintly of floor polish and processed paper, they took their seats. Karen entered moments later, alone. No lawyer, no handler. She wore a navy blue dress and her expression was as composed as ever, like a woman walking into a garden club luncheon. She looked directly at Molly only once, offering a small, enigmatic smile. then turned toward the judge's bench with perfect poise. The hearing began with procedural overviews. Molly's lawyer was articulate, meticulous, and firm. He presented a timeline of events, displayed photographs of the damage, delivered copies of municipal zoning approvals, and even submitted the report from the historical survey that had debunked the legacy pathway Karen so adamantly referenced. He played the edited security footage showing the gate opening without visible entry, cross-referenced it with time stamps, and explained the manipulation of digital records. He included the delivery order for the sensor equipment and the fraudulent form posts. Everything was laid out, not dramatized, not embellished, just exposed, brick by brick, as it had happened. Karen's turn to speak came without legal representation. She declined to make a statement under oath, instead offering what the court clerk called a supplemental narrative, which amounted to a typed letter of nearly poetic prose. She spoke of memory, of her childhood in the neighborhood, of a time before fences and locks when neighbors moved freely between yards, sharing pies and watching their children grow. She described the gate not as an intrusion, but as a symbol of return, a reconnection to shared soil, and referenced Molly's resistance as a barrier born from personal pain projected onto public heritage. Her voice never wavered. She quoted her own grandfather. She referred to the wall as the final erasure of a community's passage through time, and she ended her statement with a quiet line that sent a cold line of air down Molly's spine. I did not invade anything. I simply reopened what should never have been sealed. There was no cross-examination, no outburst, no objection. The judge, a gray-haired woman with a face that betrayed nothing, simply thanked them both, called a recess, and returned 20 minutes later with a preliminary ruling. The court acknowledged that while emotional and historical attachments to properties may exist, they do not constitute legal entitlement or override documented ownership, boundaries, or modern structural codes. The gate was deemed an illegal fixture. The wall damage was recorded as criminal property destruction, and the court issued a temporary protective order requiring Karen Ellis to cease all direct or indirect contact with Molly Burke, and to remain no less than 30 feet from the eastern property line. In addition, the judge granted a partial injunction to allow Molly to pursue civil damages in a higher court. The language was measured, dry, and appropriately vague, but to Molly, it felt like something had broken open inside her chest. Not triumph, not vengeance, just the brief exhale of someone who has been holding breath for too long. Karen didn't flinch. She accepted the ruling with a small nod and walked calmly out of the courtroom. She didn't glance back, didn't speak, didn't fume. But Molly saw it. Or rather, she didn't. The smile was gone. Whatever performance Karen had maintained was now fractured. Something behind her eyes had changed. Not rage, not defeat, just vacancy. That was more unnerving than any grin. On the ride home, Molly didn't speak much. Her lawyer talked strategy, next steps, damages, possible negotiations, but she listened only with part of her attention. The legal path ahead was just machinery, necessary but slow. What weighed on her more than that was the inevitability of what came next. Because she didn't believe for a second that this was over. She was right. That evening, after walking the perimeter again, double-checking every motion light and latch, she found another box. This one wasn't on her porch or near the gate. It was inside her greenhouse. No broken glass, no forced entry. Just sitting on the potting table as though it had always belonged. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a smooth stone, hand-painted with the words, "Nothing truly ends." No note, no fingerprints, no identifying marks. Just the stone. Reggie whined low in his throat. Molly didn't call the police this time. She simply picked up the stone, walked into her garage, and locked it in a cabinet. Then she stood still for a long time, eyes closed, counting backward from 100, reminding herself that fear only wins when it stops you from acting. That night, she slept for 3 hours. When she awoke before dawn, her house was quiet. The gate was still shut. The sky hadn't yet changed color. And for a brief moment, in the breathless silence before morning, she believed, truly believed, it was over. Then, just before sunrise, a sound shattered the illusion. Not glass, not metal. Something softer. A thud. She stepped out onto the porch and saw it immediately. Her garden had been dug up. The rose bed she had cultivated for months was overturned. Earth churned, roots broken. A narrow trench cut straight from the gate to her porch, one long, deliberate line of ruin. No animal did this. It was too precise. Molly dropped to her knees in the mud, her hands sinking into the soil like she was searching for something she had lost. She didn't cry. Not then. But her shoulders shook with something deeper, an anger so raw it nearly burned through her bones. This was the last act of defiance, the final whisper that said, "You haven't won. Not yet." She stood, covered in dirt, walked into her kitchen and called her lawyer. "File everything," she said. "Every charge, every option. We're not holding back anymore." He didn't ask why. He just said, "Understood." Then Molly showered, changed into clean clothes, and began to replant. Because that was the only act that mattered now. Not rebuilding from scratch, but reasserting her right to remain, root by root. The weeks that followed felt suspended, as though time had frayed at the edges, and Molly lived between moments, anchored only by the repetition of daily action. She restructured her days around a new kind of silence. Not the peace she had once sought when she first bought the house, but a deliberate, functional quiet where every sound could be heard clearly and assigned meaning. The trench Karen had carved through her garden had been filled, packed and replanted with thick-stemmed ferns and thorned bushes. Nothing decorative, nothing inviting. Just plants that resisted intrusion. Her private security remained active for 2 more weeks before scaling back to occasional drive-bys. The legal filings advanced steadily. Her attorney filed for damages, submitted restraining orders as permanent motions, and issued subpoenas for Karen's involvement in the forum's smear campaign, supported by server trace logs and metadata pulled from the uploaded photograph that had appeared online. Ironically, the same photo found in the wooden box, now confirmed as digitized and posted from a masked IP address linked to Karen's home router. It wasn't just obsessive behavior, it was documentation of intent. Karen, however, remained physically absent. Her house was quiet, her mail untouched for days at a time. Occasionally, a curtain would move, or a porch light would blink on and off without rhythm. The ambiguity of her presence became its own kind of pressure. Molly never knew whether she was watching or simply no longer there. It didn't matter. The war was over. The final maneuver had been Karen's. Desperate, unhinged, and ineffective. She had shown her hand too many times, and now it was evidence. But closure wasn't relief. It wasn't even resolution. It was just a shift in temperature, something colder, more stable. One morning, Molly stepped into her backyard with coffee in hand and looked toward the gate. It was shut, as it had been since the court order, but its presence no longer pulsed like an open nerve. The wall bore scars, faint but real, and she had accepted they would never fully vanish. She didn't want them to. She had earned them. Nearby, Reggie sniffed the edge of the garden bed, tail relaxed. It was the first time in weeks he'd left her side without tension. That meant something. There were no new packages, no letters, no late-night thuds or cryptic objects waiting on her steps. Just weather. Just the sound of wind through the fencing and the creak of branches overhead. She walked the perimeter once more, hand grazing the brick where the hole had once been. Her contractor had done a good job. The match was nearly perfect, but she could still feel the difference with her fingers. A month later, Karen's property was listed for sale. Quietly, without signage, handled through a private firm. The listing didn't mention its history, its unusual lot position, or the public dispute. Just square footage, roof age, and well-maintained garden features. Molly didn't inquire, didn't approach. She watched as movers loaded neutral-looking furniture into trucks. Karen never appeared. Whether she was there behind the curtains or had already vanished weeks before, Molly never learned. She didn't need to. The presence that had haunted the boundary between them was gone, and that absence spoke louder than any final word. When the new owners arrived, a young couple with a toddler and too much optimism, they knocked politely on Molly's door to introduce themselves. She smiled, shook their hands, accepted the bottle of wine they offered, and said, without elaboration, "If you ever have any questions about the gate, just ask me directly. No history here is worth keeping quiet." They laughed nervously, unsure of the meaning, but nodded. Molly didn't elaborate. She returned to her kitchen, poured a glass from the very wine they'd gifted her, and sat by the window. The sun hit the wall just right, casting the gate's shadow long and diagonal across her lawn. It was strange to think it might remain there, sealed, unusable, irrelevant. But that was the thing about structures like these. Their power didn't come from function. It came from how people saw them. That evening, Molly opened her laptop and reread the statement she had written weeks before. Her own account, her chronology, her evidence, her voice unfiltered. She added one final line to it, then closed the file and backed it up in 3 separate locations. Not because she feared it would be needed again, but because she believed in documentation, that if stories weren't preserved, they'd be rewritten by the people most willing to distort them. Outside, Reggie barked once, sharply. She stood, looked through the window, and saw nothing. No movement, no breach. Just dusk, settling softly over everything. And for the first time since the gate appeared, Molly felt something she hadn't dared to name. Peace. Not safety, not closure, but the freedom to stop anticipating, to live with the gate as an object, not a threat, to let the war become memory. And so, she did.